Good morning, everyone. This session is Students and the Culture Shift Towards Accessibility. I'm Rebecca Meshter. I'm a faculty member at SUNY Oswego. I teach in the Interaction Design program in our Department of Art and Design. And I've been involved in our kind of accessibility initiatives on campus since I arrived in 2012, so for 10 years. When I first arrived, I did a lot of work around accessibility, specifically in the classes that I teach. So I teach mostly web design and interactive media. So most of the work was there. Eventually, I started working with the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching as the associate director. And during that time, we started a work group on accessibility practices and kind of started to institutionalize some of our efforts. That work group on accessibility practices has done a number of things on campus to kind of move our accessibility practices forward, including building out a pretty popular accessibility website that includes a lot of tutorials, resources, and introduction to accessibility. We launched a Faculty Accessibility Fellows program, which has existed for 4 years. And that essentially invites faculty to participate as fellows for a calendar year. And during that time, they level up their skills in digital accessibility, do a lot of discussion and work around UDL, Universal Design for Learning, as well as inclusive teaching practices. And then they incorporate all of these practices into the classes they teach, and then act as an advocate and kind of liaison to their disciplines, departments, and the schools in which they teach within. The work group also has launched 10-day and 5-day accessibility challenges that operate during weekdays, during popular professional development times on our campus, including our winter breakouts in January. And we've also done some workshops and things during our spring breakouts in May. And those challenges are an opportunity for folks across campus, staff, faculty, and students to level up their skills. And then the main work of the accessibility practices work group is to really facilitate training and coaching around accessibility and expand the accessibility efforts on our campus. This work group is connected to our IT accessibility steering committee as well. So the work that we do is the work group is really about building a culture of accessibility. And we do that with kind of 3 prongs. We think about modeling accessibility practices. So as advocates, we're showing and demonstrating what it means to do work in an accessible way. Educate, right? And so that might be in the classroom, it might be through professional development opportunities through our website, et cetera. And then also by being leaders, making sure we're bringing up the topic of accessibility at any of the tables that we sit at, and then also coaching others to be leaders and advocates in this space. When we start thinking about shifting a campus culture more towards accessibility, we really need to think about students. And when we think about students, we need to think about kind of 2 domains, this kind of student life aspect, as well as the academic aspect. And so some of the examples that I'm going to share with you today about inviting students to participate fall into both of those categories. And we're looking to expand those practices more and more. Like the image on this screen of a kid dressed up as a construction worker, some of our goals here around student involvement are aspirational and really a work in progress. Including students has been a long-time value of mine, and also embedded in the work of the work group as a founding member of that work group. But the work that we want to do and the work that we are continuing to do is still really very much a work in progress. So lots of room to still improve and grow. One of the things that we can do, no matter what our role is on campus, is to provide accessible materials. And this is a really important modeling exercise. We model our accessibility practices in the assignments that we create as instructors, in the communication that we share, whether or not we're in administration, staff, faculty, or students communicating with other students. And then we're also checking our third-party materials. So if we're sharing digital resources and things like that, that we're checking ahead of time to make sure that those meet accessibility standards. When we do this and we model these behaviors, we're starting to establish a culture of expectation, right? People can depend on it, and then they know the things that they can do when materials meet these standards. As teachers, we have a real opportunity to shift the culture of our campuses by really inviting students to participate in this culture shift. And one of the best ways we can do this is actually through assignment requirements. Now, one of the things that I would suspect folks might push against immediately is, well, accessibility, Rebecca, is part of your discipline, right? You are a designer, so the kinds of things that you teach, accessibility would be built into maybe the curriculum already. But I would argue that all of our disciplines share things publicly, share things digitally. And so just like we have normalized teaching standards like APA or MLA formatting, we can also do these same, create these same kinds of expectations and requirements around accessibility. And to teach those basic skills, just like we do when we're teaching those formats. So if you make things a requirement or an expectation, students will rise to the occasion. They'll meet those expectations. One of the easiest things you can do is to kind of introduce a basic level of requirement, like it must pass an automated accessibility checker. So if you're turning in a Google document or you're turning in a Word document or a PDF, those things would need to pass those built-in automated checkers. They're not perfect, of course, and they don't catch all of the accessibility issues, but they do cause folks to pay attention to accessibility and also have some coaching built into them about some of the challenges that you might face when you're creating a document. For example, you might have some accessibility barriers, but then these checkers often provide guidance about how to fix and resolve these things. So as an instructor, there's a real opportunity here to invite students to be really important participants in this. It allows us to talk about accessibility as being important to our disciplines and as a way to make our disciplines more inclusive. What I really like about the idea of assignment requirements, and we've had a number of our faculty fellows go on to kind of build this into assignments that they offer in their classes across a wide array of disciplines, is that it breaks down this expectation or this assumption that folks in our classes are non-disabled. Right? In other words, it shifts the conversation to assume that someone might need these accessibility materials or that accessible materials would make everyone's lives easier or would improve everyone's experience. So one thing you could consider as an instructor is making this a requirement when the materials are going to be shared with others. So if they're shared with peers or if they're shared more publicly, like in an open pedagogy project. So like this image on the screen, which is of some folks laying some foundation, right, with concrete. We want to make sure that we're setting the foundation of our understanding of a discipline to include accessible practices so that when we're just starting to practice in a particular discipline or starting behaviors in a particular discipline, we're including accessibility from the very beginning. This is going to change culture not only in our campuses, but within our disciplines and in our society as a whole. Another place where we can, as instructors, really help to invite students to participate in this cultural shift is by demonstrating accessibility features. And this image on the screen of a kid holding a really big book, a child, maybe preschool age, looking shocked and surprised is a very similar face that I get when I share some accessibility tools with students in my classes. So I might introduce them to things like alternative formats that they have access to using Ally in the learning management system, how they can effectively use searchable text. So when we have accessible digital materials, the text is searchable, whether it's a document or if it's captions or if it's a transcript of something, and how you can effectively use those kind of searches to narrow in to get specific information to save time. We often have tools that have read aloud features that you might not even be aware of. So our mobile devices have this built into them. Acrobat has this feature built into it. And when I share that with students who might struggle with reading, some of them are really surprised. They didn't even know that they had that tool available to them, and it can really help them with comprehension. Same thing with speech to text. A lot of the tools that we already use have some of these features built into them, and we just might not be aware that we have access to it. So demonstrating and normalizing the behavior of using these tools can really help everyone feel more included and really help folks who might be struggling. Another feature I like to highlight for students is the outline view in documents. So for example, in Google Docs or in Microsoft Word, there's an outline view that uses the heading structure to provide an outline of the document. This can help everyone get a better understanding what a document is about and how it's organized, and also really important to the way that we organize our own materials. So even when I'm taking minutes of a meeting and I share and distribute those minutes, I make sure that I set up my document to be really accessible. I use headings. It has this structure to help folks navigate through. We can also share keyboard navigation and normalize that not everyone uses a mouse or a touch screen, that some folks use a keyboard, and sometimes that can be really efficient. So the more we demonstrate these accessibility features and using assistive technology, we normalize that this is an inclusive practice. We normalize these behaviors and make it okay to take advantage of these features. This is really important to moving our accessibility needle and really improving the culture of our campuses to be more inclusive. Higher education and our educational systems overall are very ableist in nature, and the more we can do to be more inclusive, right, and normalize accessibility and assume that folks are going to need accessibility feature, the better it is for everybody and for the learning experience overall. One of the things that we've worked really hard to do on our campus, and we want to do more, is including students in all of our professional development activities. So rather than setting our 10-day challenge or our accessibility website for faculty and staff only, we invite students to participate. It's really valuable for students to participate alongside of professionals so that they can see lifelong learning in practice, to see what it means to kind of iteratively improve our skill sets and continuously level up. I think often we don't think of students around professional development because we think they might not be interested, but our students are really savvy. The students that choose to participate in things like this are really aware of how this is going to help their careers, right? So just like this image on the screen of a couple of folks carrying a plank to continue building out a boardwalk, we need to work together with students to continue building out this boardwalk that allows for more and more folks to participate in our accessibility efforts. Every time we have one of these professional development opportunities, we're really helping folks level up their skills. Now these are folks who are better advocates and can help others who have a set of skills that are not as well developed, right? So we really start kind of using this train the trainers model. And the more folks we have participating in these opportunities, the more places we have opportunities to kind of build into those things. There's a question in the discussion forum about demonstrating or showing alternative formats. And so one of the things that we have access to on our campus is Ally. We've had it in Blackboard, and I've heard we're going to have it in Brightspace as well. And that's a tool that allows, let's say I upload a Word document to share with students. I might make sure that that meets all accessibility standards. And when I do that, it also allows Ally can transform that tool into alternative formats like an MP3 so they can listen to it, and web version so that they might be able to use a screen reader with it more effectively. So that's often how I show alternative formats. With other things like the read aloud, I just open up, a document that we might have that I've maybe requested students do for homework. Maybe they need to read something, and I show them all the ways that they might be able to use a tool like Acrobat more effectively to meet them where they're at. Another piece that I really want to encourage, and this came out of a lot of my experience around accessibility generally, but also some research that Dr. Amy Fisk and I have done. Dr. Amy Fisk is at SUNY Geneseo, and we've done some of this work, some research and some interviews with students with disabilities during remote learning during the pandemic. And what we've really found is that if students are included in some of these policy discussions, some of the barriers that they face become more clear to us, right, as administrators, as faculty, et cetera. And then we can better design policies and practices to support our students more effectively. So we really, really encourage our students to participate in these spaces. This is an area where we really have room to grow, but we have started inviting students to participate in our work group on accessibility practices. This increased kind of representation on the committee is really helpful. It allows us to have more insight into some other spaces. So for example, we might be more aware of upcoming events that student clubs are hosting, for example, where we might be able to, infiltrate, right, and offer up our services and provide workshops and training. By including our students in these kind of policy discussions, we're really also increasing our capacity to address some of the training needs and wants across campus. Really, there's kind of a core group of us that work on the work group, and we have limited time and resources. And so the more folks that are involved in the work group are more folks that can kind of tap different communities within our campus, which I think is really valuable. The other thing that we have done on our campus is also make sure that we have some internship or assistantship opportunities that focus on accessibility for students. It helps support the work that we're doing on our campus, but also gives some really valuable professional development opportunities for the students. Our digital services team on our campus is one of the most valuable opportunities that some of our design students have had the opportunity to work on, because they've gotten to do a lot of accessibility related work related to the website and some other things by being a member of that group. There's some great comments in the chat here. Kathleen G noted that for her online courses, I throw in "did you know" hints that prompt students to use these kinds of features, and they're always surprised. That's definitely been my experience as well, Kathleen, so thanks for sharing that. And Kristen Croyle noted that it's also important to kind of include students in planning and work, not just communications. And I agree. When they contribute, they have so much to contribute. We often underestimate how much value they can provide to some of these opportunities. One of the other things that we've really started moving into, and this is something that I'd love for us to do more and more of, but again, we need to increase this capacity by involving more students in the work group to be able to do this, is some direct outreach. One of the things that we started doing this academic year is doing some accessibility audits with student media organizations. So for example, this spring, I sat down with our student radio station, WNYO. I met with kind of their lead on their website. We recorded the audit so they would have it for future reference. We went through some various sites and parts of the website to talk about some of the features and things. And then I allowed them, we had Q&A, I could answer some questions, and then we talked about strategies for addressing some of the issues or barriers that their audiences might face on their website moving forward. And then finally, the other thing that we've done, and this has a lot to do with having faculty and, club organization leaders and students in our work group, is that we become more aware of workshops and student conferences and things that students are planning. And then we can outreach to those groups and say, hey, as part of the work that you're doing, would you like some accessibility training built in? We'd be happy to provide it. And this has offered some really great opportunities. So for example, in our School of Business, the students were organizing a really great kind of inclusive diversity conference, and faculty from our work group, Michelle Thornton, reached out to that group and said, hey, would you like us to help support some of the work that you're doing? And they offered a workshop at that conference. So that's been really, really helpful. Elise put a note in the chat about it's important to assume that students don't necessarily know the tech or how to navigate it just because they're young, and that's so important, right? We can't expect any of our colleagues, peers, students, et cetera, to have these skill sets. And how would they know unless someone has showed them? It's the same thing about accessibility practices generally, right? When we're making and creating documents, how would our students know how to do that unless we take the time to kind of introduce them to the idea and show them the way? This is what we kind of found with some of the student media organizations, is that they just really weren't aware. And as soon as we brought it to their attention, they were really committed to wanting to work on this more. So I know that this is work that will be continuing in the next academic year in a pretty concrete and direct way. And there's another note in the chat about kind of working with the Education Honor Society and have the e-board get some on-the-job training. So those are really great examples of ways that you can get student organizations to kind of level up, maybe at the leadership level. Maybe that's the place where your equivalent of a work group might work or target. And then those are the individuals who then can share out to their kind of group membership, which can be really helpful. The key thing here is that our students are the future of our disciplines. They're the future of our community. And so empowering our students to be accessibility advocates and experts is really important to the work that we do at public institutions in particular. Our students are leaders now, and we want them to continue being leaders. So, when we have a boardroom like the image on this screen, maybe it's in a large city for a really influential organization, and we have a student there who's been exposed to accessibility practices and can say, hey, we need to think about accessibility from the beginning. We're having a lot of influence far beyond our institutions to break down kind of ableist structures and really just provide more access to all of the things that our students will be involved in creating in the future. My last takeaway for everyone is that students are really key to our cultural change, and I encourage all of you to find ways to invite students to participate in the accessibility work of our campuses. They should be doing this in the classroom. They should be doing this in their clubs. They're really important members of our community, and the work shouldn't necessarily, or the burden shouldn't feel like it always falls on staff, right, to do some of this work. It's really a community effort, and that means involving all of the community in the work that we do. I'd love to take any questions or elaborate on anything that folks had questions on. There's some great conversation happening in the chat about sharing some resources and things. So that's wonderful. Love to see all of that. And Kathleen noted that I love it when students start being experts with each other on this work. They feel like rock stars and are, and that's such a great way to put it. Thanks for sharing that. Stephen asked, do you have any tips or strategies for handling non-accessible journal articles? This is a perennial problem. Always looking for good tips or possible advocacy. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge. PDFs can be the culprit here, and a lot of journals don't necessarily put their materials out in an accessible format. Typically, if a journal has more of a web presence and they do publish some of their articles and things on the web, often that version of the material is more accessible than maybe a PDF version or a print version of the journal. So that might be something to think about. I know as a researcher who gets published in journals, I push back on accessibility issues and try to get things that I publish to be as accessible as possible and try to raise awareness with the journals that, that I might engage with. And if they're not willing to bend or flex or try to do better, then I don't necessarily need to publish there. So that's something to think about. It's really kind of pushing on the publishers. And I think one thing that we can do collectively, and this is something I'd love SUNY to be doing collectively, is to really push on publishers to do a better job. And so if we know that there's journals that we're using regularly, are important to our disciplines, important to our teaching in particular, that we really push on those journals. And if we do that in a collective way rather than an individual way, we're going to have a lot better opportunity for influence and to get things to improve. Let's see. Yeah, there's some conversation about using the library. Laura Harris from our library chimed in. She's also a member of our work group. The library has been really great at helping us locate more accessible versions of things, helping us make accessible versions of things, and also pushing on publishers as well. I know one thing our work group worked on was kind of a draft note that we haven't really shared out in the way that I think we had hoped and maybe will do in the near future. So that faculty, for example, had a draft note that you could send to a publisher as a way to kind of push on the accessibility practices. Let's see. I don't know if did I miss any questions? Let's see. The chat is going wild. It's hard to keep up. Is there anything else that I can answer for folks? I love that everyone's sharing resources and ideas in the chat. So Brandon just asked a question about examples of faculty incorporating accessibility elements into their assignments and how they're evaluating it. So Brandon, for example, in my classes, it's a rubric item. Perhaps I can leverage that a little bit more because I'm in a design field, but I always include that as a rubric item for kind of public-facing projects that students are working on. For some folks that were in education, I believe, they equated it to similar kinds of requirements to, formatting, grammar, spelling, those kinds of things. So it might be a rubric item. Maybe it's not as heavily weighted as some other things, but definitely included as a rubric item. I know that some other folks that have done things like podcast projects, they require a transcript as part of that assignment. So the transcript would be something that's evaluated just like the podcast itself would be evaluated, and making sure that it's, has been taken care of, right, and nurtured. Anything else? Kathleen did note that when students build e-portfolios, I include rubric items regarding things like alt text, color choice, and structure. It can be really helpful to be very explicit with students about very specific requirements. So maybe it's not meet all the accessibility requirements under the sun, but like, let's move in the right direction by doing these 3 things. And then that provides a bit of a checklist for students to make sure that they're kind of attending to important details. Some of the things that I do often in assignments is, the structure part and using headings correctly is really important. Alt text is something I try to get my students to do. Color contrast is a really easy thing for them to kind of pay attention to. And contextual hyperlinks is something else that's pretty easy to implement, that are really easy kind of like checklist items that can get folks up and going pretty easily. And it's not a big lift. Anything else? I'm reading the chat. Kathleen noted that reducing reds and greens, they love red and pink. Yeah, some of the high contrast tools and showing them some contrast checkers can be a really useful investment of time. And it really doesn't take that much time to show someone how to use those things. So thank you all for your attention, the great conversation and sharing of resources. I look forward to connecting with you at other moments of the conference. Feel free to reach out. I'm happy to connect.